Vavna. Thank you, Antonio, and thank you, Katya. I'm very happy to be here this morning with you in Dhaka. So I'll take the title of this session on printed matter as a point of departure to return to the world of print. That of books, of journals, of daily newspapers that were bought, read, and reread, and finally discarded or sold to the Kabadibala in South Asia. And I confess that one of my great pleasures when researching publications is a sensory one of holding these publications in my hand, the pleasure that I derive from the smell of paper and from the beauty of the design. And it's today, as we know, a slow dying and a soon archived past that I'm referring to. Like several others here, I've studied in damp libraries many publications from the pre- and the post-independence and partition era. And these publications have guided me towards forgotten or little-known artworks, and there have been many fascinating discoveries in this respect, but it's not what I'm going to focus on today. Reviews matter not only because we've partly lost in our daily habits the pleasure of reading print, but also because of their way of ordering meaning. The use of search engines like Google or of digital data banks like JSTOR guide us towards individual texts. Individual articles have become accessible, as you know, in isolation of the issues they were commissioned for. And this is without mentioning, of course, the way search engines also direct us towards specific articles, and this is based on our previous searches. So opportunities, in short, for discovery and for making challenging connections seem to be narrowing by the day. My focus today is going to be on the first years of the quarterly journal MARG. When I say first years, I'll run roughly until the mid-1960s. This journal was founded in 1946 by the writer Mulkwaj Anand, and it was published from Bombay. MARG is an acronym for the Modern Architectural Research Group. It's a reference to the British Mars Group, and it's also a word that means pathway in Sanskrit. When I was asked to discuss printed matters, I chose to focus on MARG because it's very much the leading art and architectural review of the early post-independence era in India. It's a choice that imposed itself quite naturally. On Thursday, during the critical writing ensemble, Rosalind de Miller, who is not here with us today, unfortunately, called for a close reading of primary documents, such as the writings, in her case, of Richard Bartholomew. And I think she rightly said that much more can often be gained from these primary sources than from many secondary sources. And this retrieval of the past, of some of the important voices, if you will, of modern and contemporary South Asian art, informs, I think, many of the presentations that we've heard during the critical writing ensemble. And they constitute a crucial moment for the study of Indian art and of South Asian art, more broadly speaking, that we're all in different ways participating in. Shukla Savant and myself recently contributed to a book on Ibrahim Al-Qazi, and there have been other engagements with critics, collectors, and gallerists such as Kiku Gandhi. And what interests me in these figures is that they hold the position of what the French called the passeur, which is a mediator who's an agent of transmission. And this was also the case of the editor of MARG, Mulkwaj Anand. What's important in the case of MARG is that it brings out connections that would otherwise be invisible. Connections between Indian artists and foreign artists working in India, and between Indian past legacies and contemporary artistic production. The creation of MARG can be located towards the end of a period during which illustrated magazines, many of which published, of course, by artists, were sites of creation across the world, rather than of documentation and interpretation on art. And in that sense, MARG is not an experimental magazine, though it does offer unexpected associations between text and image. It does not share the iconoclasm of other reviews. And most important, its principal aim was to document and possibly also try to shape artistic production in India, as well as the reception of art. After independence, exhibitions were still few and far between in India. And even in art publications, texts arguably mattered more than images, if only because of the space they took up in a single issue. The importance attributed to design and image reproduction in MARG is an exception in this regard. Designed from 1955 by Dolly Sahar and still indebted to the constructivist legacy, MARG distinguished itself through variations between paper textures and typefaces and its numerous and often full-page reproductions that could take up to half of the review. But texts on art contributed first and foremost to critical debates, which were not always only about art. And MARG just puts its design very much at the service of its editorial line. Now, the aim of the review, I quote, was to stimulate a popular interest and appreciation of architecture in India and to help improve its standard in general. To this end, a critical framework was set up in its pages, I quote, to create some values, critical texts, or considerations to which it may be possible to sift the really important artworks from the bad ones. We believe, it's stated in another article, that the aims of a journal of art today should be to help new shoots of creative activity to grow at the same time as it disseminates information about the great masterpieces of the old tradition. But far from limiting itself only to the field of architecture, the magazine would cover, I quote, everything, in fact, that has any relation to architecture and art. Mulkraj Anand later referred to the first article of MARG as a form of manifesto. And this article took the shape of a didactic mix of text and image. Along the main text was an opinionated take on the development of Indian architecture, ran quotes by Le Corbusier, Ernest Benthil-Havel, and many others, and it had illustrations ranging from sketches of ancient Greek cities to photographs of the Ellora caves and of the Buland Darwaza at Fatehpur Sikri. The text exhorted readers to move beyond the state of present architecture. It asked, are we so bankrupt in imagination and inspiration that we are unable to create our own art forms, giving expression to our modern way of life with that freedom which is still before us? The freedom which a wise use of the machine as a new and wondrous tool can bestow on us. It also criticized any form of latent parochial nationalism, if you will. It's meaningless for us, it declared, to think in terms of an Indian style of architecture, of Indian traditional architecture. And concluded that modern science and the machine speak a common language, which in breaking down the old regional and social barriers, gives an expression of life common to all the peoples of the world. End of quote. And this very much utopian worldview and the belief in the power of industrialization to improve the quality of life of the masses would be reflected in the other topics covered in MARG, which range from urbanism and town planning to unemployment. And one of the images that you see here on the loop is the cover of one of the issues of MARG, which has a Christ painted by, or drawn rather, by Francis Newton Sousa, and the title Unemployment, which you can probably read on top of it. So it's inverted, it's upside down. One of the aims of the review was to revalorize and to interpret artistic legacies that had been denigrated under colonialism, but without falling in the trap of what it referred to as Coomaraswamy's exaltation merely of metaphysical spirituality and iconography. And today, we of course mainly consider modernist achievements of the post-independence era, India's equivalent, if you will, of Louis Kahn Assembly Building. But we tend to forget that there was also a strong revivalist current in India at the time. And in that sense, art and architecture of the post-independence period should be, I think, considered against the context in which they emerged. My point is that modernist architecture in India, or the paintings of the progressive artist group that were very much championed in MARG, didn't impose themselves naturally, but against the strong revivalist currents, and they were constantly challenged. MARG's criticism, as you may have gathered, was passionate, and it was also deeply engaged with its audience. Many editorials and articles are repetitive, but at least they have the virtue of making their goal very explicit. The journal's contributors were not only opinionated and polemical, they felt invested with a wider sense of purpose of the post-independence era. The journal's early years belong, in that sense, to an optimistic Nehruvian phase and stand in stark contrast with the crisis of universal values that would happen in India and, of course, in many other places across the world in the late 60s and in the 1970s, when artists and intellectuals began to question the Nehruvian vision upheld by the first independence generation, and when the Indian state and its institutions, rather than colonialism, became the subject of critical scrutiny. The reading of MARG therefore also begs questions on the role of the public intellectual after independence, when many moved from an outsider status, fighting within the nationalist struggle, to institutional and other influential positions, and this was the case of Mokraj Anand. During these few days at the Critical Writing Ensemble, I think we've heard several comments against what has been called a linear history, to which rational explanations, generally speaking, seems to be associated. And partly derived from my reading of MARG, I'd like to emphasize the importance, however, of argumentation and of critical reasoning for the production of alternative knowledge and for questioning the status quo. The importance of writing, if you will, through the mind, as much as through the body, to return to another expression that's been used previously. And I think these two forms of writing don't need to be disconnected. Commenting in 1967 on Indian art of the 1950s, just going back to that period, the critic Jaya Appaswamy described in the pages of MARG this decade as an opening onto the world, from local nationalistic idioms to a world international language, she wrote. And as an art historian working on India, I've long been concerned with a methodological rethinking of what has long been, of course, a Western-centered art history. But my point is not to replace a narrow colonial interpretation with a different but yet equally reductive nationalist lens. First and foremost, because this wouldn't do justice to the debates that nurtured the Indian art world of the time. The immediate post-independence period, which I'm concerned with today, was dense in networks and in two-way transfers between India and foreign artists, writers, and intellectuals. Arguably, these also predated independence. For instance, at Shantiniketan, and there have been some very important presentations in this respect, especially the first day of the Critical Writing Ensemble. And I would, in that sense, actually partly disagree with Jaya Appaswamy's reference to local nationalist idioms and the sort of simple arc that she draws. For Indian writers, critics, and art historians of the post-independence period, few subjects mattered more than, first, the relation between India and its past, and second, between India and the outside. And when I say outside, I don't refer to what others would call Western cultural penetration in a negative way, of course. First, because influence does not necessarily mean dominance, and second, because the foreign art that was reproduced in a magazine like MARG was precisely that of the Western avant-garde that colonial art education had tried to cut India from. In addition, there was also, as I said, a strong desire to retrieve and reinvest one's own past. From the start, MARG tried to create a form of musée imaginaire by reproducing rarely seen Indian artworks that were either held in foreign collections or scattered throughout the country, and also by engaging with some of India's most important pre-colonial legacies, both Hindu and Islamic, I should add. Now, to give you a sense of the content, you've been seeing these images on the loop for a few minutes, but I'll just comment on a couple of them. To give you an idea of the content of MARG from 1946, the year of its creation, to the early 60s, we find stunning portfolios of photographer Raymond Burnier, who's affirming the power of the erotic Hindu sculptures of Khajuraho. And these sculptures, whose iconography had been belittled under colonialism, were very much part of a confiscated history that is here being reclaimed. We also find photographs taken in Jaipur by Henri Cartier-Bresson, and it's important to stress that these are the results of a commission by the state of Jaipur in 1948, and if I'm not mistaken, this publication, which is very badly reproduced, very difficult to find, very precious, predates his catalogue at MoMA, the Catalogue of His Retrospect, and was in that sense his first publication. Many articles were also dedicated to the building of Chandigarh. And in addition, the magazine carried many articles on important sculptors and painters of the time, especially those of the progressive artist group. And here I chose to show you images of other sculptors, this Dhanraj Bhagat, Ramkinka Bej, on which we heard more, I think, on Tuesday, and Pilu Bojkanarla. There's also an image nude by Lionel Vent, which I included because works of his are here in this exhibition. And you can also notice that the documentary form, whether in film and in photography, was very much the genre that was favored by MARG. In the late 60s, slightly after the period I'm discussing, MARG also ran several articles on the triennial Indias that were started in 1967, at the time when Mulkraj Anand is now the chairman of the Lalit Kala Academy. And that sort of traces the arc of Mulkraj Anand, who starts by being a member of the anti-colonial diaspora and then returns to India, launches MARG, and becomes the chairman of a major institution, creates the triennial India, which is then boycotted by a second generation of artists, including Vivan Sundaram. You know this very well. The contributors of MARG engaged with the outside world with a great deal of confidence. Edited from Bombay, the magazine was turned towards developments both within India and in foreign art centers. It was aimed at a relatively small, elite Indian audience, but also at an international one. With its third issue, MARG starts to publish reviews of exhibitions in the major centers of Bombay, Delhi, Calcutta, and Madras. And from its second year of publications, it also translates some of its articles into French. And this is where periodicals of the so-called periphery, engaged in a transnational dialogue, and those of the center, that often remain Eurocentric, may differ. We're, of course, I think, all familiar with the role of printed matter as lines of transmissions. Take, for example, the primary role attributed to magazines in the display Modernité Plurielle at the Centre Pompidou. And at an empirical level, we know how well prints circulated. I think we've all heard the example of issues of art form reaching Soviet Russia. And it's, of course, less surprising to find Soviet publications being so important in India after the Second World War. Second, and I think more important for us, printed matters published from a specific location enabled the affiliation with an unbound community and an often purported universal one, as Pascal Casanova explains in La République des Lettres. What matters to me is not so much that we find in the pages of MARG articles on the geographically distant architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright or on abstract art at the Institute of Chicago, but that the review urges us to engage with an Indian art world that was profoundly international, and that both in practice and in terms of its outlook. This international dimension of Indian art goes beyond, if you will, the increased mobility of artists. It's more than the sum of all the contacts that can be traced, whether during Indian artist fellowships abroad or through foreign artists who come to India. There's also, as the result of, I think, more profound and complex developments, artworks and texts that are produced in India that are part of a shared imaginary. And this imaginary doesn't have to be geographically defined. If Europe is a universal paradigm for modernity, then the history of Europe, as Dipesh Chakrabarty argues, belongs to all and affects us all. Historically speaking, of course, this form of Eurocentrism imposed itself to the detriment of pre-colonial inter-Asian connections. And we are therefore left with a model that does paradoxically reaffirm the importance and the centrality of Paris, London, and New York as world capitals, but one that also considers cities such as Bombay and Calcutta in India as some of the many sites across the world that participated in this virtual cosmopolis. And in the case of MARG, the importance of Bombay, a city of migrants that had welcomed many German and Austrian Jewish intellectuals just before the Second World War, cannot be neglected. And in that sense, Bombay participated not only in a virtual cosmopolis, it was also a major site of transnational exchange within India. And I'll end before concluding by quoting the speech of a short passage from the speech of Octavio Paz, someone who was very influential also for Indian artists, when he received the Nobel Prize in 1990. And he said, this is the English translation of his text, For us as Spanish Americans, the real present was not in our own countries. It was the time lived by others, by the English, the French, and the Germans. It was the time of New York, Paris, London. We had to go and look for it and bring it back home. These years were also the years of my discovery of literature. I began writing poems. And this bringing back home that Baz refers to inscribed itself as much in the act, I think, of reading printed matters as of writing and publishing. And he was, in that sense, very much writing through the mind as much as through the body. To conclude, in an editorial published in December 1963, Mokwaj Anand decried the fact that Marg's program had not materialized in any sustained artistic output, or what he deemed to be a sustained artistic output, and criticized what he described as a form of narrow-mindedness. I quote him, "The cliché used by the people who understand neither the Manasara nor Leonardo nor Frank Lloyd Wright is that we in India are not Indians anymore, but prefer the international style. Perhaps there's an element of truth in this vague charge. Certainly, however, we are not wasting money on domes, Pathan turrets, and Mughal cupolas a la Sir Edward Lutyens, the builder of the pompous British imperial style. We are frankly, self-consciously modernist, who followed Tagore when he said, 'I strongly urge our artists vehemently to deny their obligation carefully to produce something that can be labeled as Indian art according to some old world mannerism.'" Art criticism and the notion of crisis or of inadequacy and disappointment in this sense had, of course, long gone hand in hand. It's part of its rhetoric. But Anand urges us to consider the definition of Indian art. Though Marg belonged, as I said, to a strong, optimistic Nehruvian phase that engaged with the outside world with great confidence, there's a latent anxiety about the definition, not so much of art, but actually of the nation, that can be read in this passage from 1963. But it expressed itself through a commitment to critical reasoning and argumentation. In the years running up to the mid-1960s, the contributors of Marg never gave up the repetitive task of putting down their opinions, of rejecting forms of national parochialism, of affirming their belief in the relation between art and society, and the urgent need to engage with and to participate in international debates. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Devika. I wish I could see all of those editions. They look absolutely amazing. I want to ask you about how Marg somehow seemed to navigate the space between internationalism and revivalism, and particularly with regards to public reception. So I don't know whether it had a section dedicated to letters to the editor, for example, or was there any space in which there was a possibility of a to and fro dialogue?
No, there wasn't actually. And this is always something that is very difficult to gauge, especially if you're looking at it retrospectively. Many intellectuals, many figures of the Indian art world, such as Keku Gandhi, have stated how important Marg was for them, and for calling into being, from that perspective, a form of public sphere. There was a readership that we can try to map. We don't know the exact circulation of Marg, and from that perspective, yes, there was no possibility, and that is the case actually in many art reviews, and they differ from that perspective from everyday newspapers. There's no possibility of writing back to the editor.
Opening up now to...
Thanks very much for the presentation. I mean, I think, like Katja, I'm kind of hungry to leaf through them. I'm just curious if it's possible to, maybe even a bit crudely, whether kind of, you sketch the kind of critical orthodoxies in the, so we think of art historical publications. You mentioned art, for example, but, from Britain or the States in the 60s, the ones I'm more familiar with, we read kind of Greenberg and even the discourses, the alternative discourses were self-conscious alternative, they were always a war there. I just wonder how that was reflected in Marg. I wonder what the kind of orthodoxies were, or what the dominant currents of criticism were.
It's a very literary, talking about the style of art criticism. Is that what your question is about?
I guess maybe partly, but maybe more what the, again, to go to Greenberg, you know, this idea of Greenberg, even though it was exaggerated, or is this to extent of political vocabulary from him that became very, very dominant in the discussion, and even in ways suppressed.
The set of references is actually quite different. The people they were reading were more Herbert Reed. It was still British inflected. It did look towards America, as I said, but it didn't. The debates it participated in were actually, and the language it used, the references it used, the rhetoric it referred to, was more indebted also to Mugwaj Anand's stay in Britain during the interwar period. He comes back to India in 1946. And there were ideas, as I said, that were moved not only by a language, a rhetoric, or jargon of the art world, but also by debates on art and society that were happening within India. So it's indebted as much, if you want, to a Nehruvian vision of India, that is a commitment to secularism, a commitment to democracy, a commitment to socialism and its possibilities for alleviating poverty in India, than it is actually to debates that would be internal, quote unquote, to the art world, which is not to, I'm not forgetting Greenberg's Marxism, but it's just to sort of locate it at a different sphere.
Thank you, Devika. And yeah, like everybody else, some library time is now due. So really thank you, because I think it is important not just to look at MARG, but also look at things like Global Review and Capital. We really do need to start. I guess thinking of this in terms of a sort of time capsule memory bank, and just already have questions about some of these works and where they have ended up. In terms of Mugwaj Anand, I think it might be useful, and I'm sure a lot of you already know this, to also think about thinking of this in terms of a sort of time capsule memory bank, and just already have questions about some of these works and where they have ended up. In terms of Mugwaj Anand, I think it might be useful, and I'm sure a lot of you already know this, to also think about his role in the progressive writers movement, which was him and Sajjad here as an is also part of that sphere. And it was a group that came together in Bloomsbury, I think, in the 30s. And I think they were very prescient about what might happen post-independence, and were already trying to think about, very much as the cultural elite, what the future of literature and culture would be in a new nation that was already, and at that point it was one nation. I don't think it was that clear that there would be two or three. And in the manifesto of the Progressive Writers Movement, they actually suggest that the new language should be in Roman, that instead of that, basically the Hindi and the Urdu script should be discarded as a kind of call to a new unity, which is quite amazing to think about now.
Which the Indian military does. No, I can ask, I'm seeing Radhika Sabhabal in a few days, I can ask her. I'm not sure they know, because I had asked them in the past. And there are, if you want, information such as these, which several of us probably hit sometimes, if you questions that remain unanswered. It's distributed abroad, as I said. It does have translations of its text in French. Its dominance, its importance is unquestioned. Then in terms of numbers, it's more difficult to answer your question in concrete terms.
Thank you, Devika. I just wanted to add to something that Nada's saying in terms of the way that Mugwaj Anand also in 1949 went to Sri Lanka to do a studio visit, and he went to see George Keith,
who was one of the contributing editors.
Yeah. But it's a really interesting anecdote. The sort of close reading that one can do on this is to say, well, what was being said then, if this was also the platform from where things were being said and discussions being had. So the conversation goes that
And he's coming to Sri Lanka and he's going to see this artist, and he's asking, he lives outside the capital, and people are saying, oh, who are you going to see? And there, the Colombo elite's response is, oh, that Gauguin, the Sri Lankan Gauguin. So when he comes to the studio visit, he of course retells this to Keith, I think he actually says, those fools. And they have this very interesting kind of conversation between one another about finding all the basically foreign endorsements of artists within India. So this conversation, what's a studio visit, was in 1949. I mean, between then and now, how many millions of years we've gone through to still think about, maybe we're having the same conversation.
Yes, Subodh Gupta is still the Jeff Koons of India. Or Damien Hirst.
I'm very curious to know more about the funding of the magazine.
It's funded by the Tata Group.
Okay.
And it still is. It still exists. What happens later on is that I took a little bit of liberty with the periodization of the slides in opposition to the text that I was reading. You saw images of Expo 67 of the India Pavilion there, which a designer called Dashrath Patel designed. He showed these images, these film projections. Restate your question.
No, I'm in general about the funding and the advertisement.
But yeah, but it's still, as I said, it still exists until today. The shifts that happen is that it starts to have more and more issues that are dedicated just to one theme. So it changes its editorial, if you want, agenda because of that, because you no longer have the associations that sort of that we see here. The funding remains the same throughout. It's still the Tata Group. It's still housed their office in a building that belongs to the Tata Group. That hasn't changed.
Yeah, just to sign for something else, this will towards a kind of an internationalization happened earlier as well, which was supported by the Dhakas and Shantiniketan. So in fact, all the international residencies that began in Shantiniketan from the 1930s, all the new buildings that were built, they had to have special kind of infrastructure built. They were funded by the Tatas.
Yes.
Can I ask, since I don't know the context within which the clear power that the Tata has had historically may have changed, has there been a difference in the way in which the Tata Trust or their company and their sort of funding of the arts, has there been a change, a progression, a different reception in terms of how they were perceived then and how they're perceived now?
I'm an external observer in this respect. Others will have their own views. No, they're still extremely important, and they started with steel. It's the story of the nationalization of steel. That is what Tata was part of. They're still extremely important, and now I think they're also involved in the mining of bauxite in Orissa, together with other large corporations. It stopped? So who is funding it now? Do you know?
There is still some, like, corpus funding sort of a thing, which I was just speaking to one of their distribution heads and all, but they are solely now
Opening up now to...
Thanks very much for the presentation. I mean, I think, like Katya, I'm kind of hungry to translate through. I'm just curious if it's possible to, maybe even a bit crudely, whether kind of you sketch the kind of critical orthodoxies in the, so we think of art historical publications. You mentioned art, for example, but from Britain or the States in the 60s, the ones I'm more familiar with, kind of Greenberg and even the discourses, the alternative discourses were self-conscious alternative, they were always aboard there. I just wonder how that was inflected in MARG. I wonder what the kind of orthodoxies were, or what the dominant currents of criticism were.
It's a very literary term about the style of art criticism. Is that what your question is about?
I guess maybe partly, but maybe more even though it was exaggerated, or is this to extent a political vocabulary that became very, very dominant in discussion and even, in a way, suppressed?
The set of references is actually quite different. The people they were reading were more Herbert Reed. It was still British inflected. It did look towards America, as I said, but it didn't. The debates it participated in were actually, and the language it used, the references it used, the rhetoric it referred to, was more indebted also to Mogbaj and Steinberg during the interwar period. He comes back to India in 1946. And there were ideas, as I said, that were moved not only by a language, a rhetoric, or jargon of the art world, but also by debates on art and society that were happening within India. So it's indebted as much, if you want, to an Nehruvian vision of India as a commitment to secularism, a commitment to democracy, a commitment to socialism and its possibilities for alleviating poverty in India, than it is actually to debates that would be internal, quote unquote, to the art world, which is not to, I'm not forgetting Greenberg's Marxism, but it's just to sort of locate it at the difference here.
Hi, thank you, Devika. And yeah, like everybody else, some library time is now due. So really thank you, because I think it is important not just to look at MARG, but also look at things like model review and capital. We really do need to start. I guess thinking of this in terms of a sort of time capsule memory bank, and just already had questions about some of these works and where they have ended up. In terms of Mograjan, and I think it might be useful, and I'm sure a lot of you already know this, to also think about his role in the progressive writers movement, which was him and Sajjad Zahir, and Fez Ahmed Fez is also part of that sphere. And it was a group that came together in Bloomsbury, I think, in the 30s. And I think they were very prescient about what might happen post-independence, and were already trying to think about, very much as the cultural elite, what the future of literature and culture would be in the new nation that was already, and at that point it was one nation. I don't think it was that clear that there would be two or three. And in the manifesto of the Progressive Writers Movement, they actually suggest that the new language should be in Roman, that instead of, that basically the Hindi and the Urdu script should be discarded as a kind of call to a new unity, which is quite amazing to think about now.
Actually, in the military, that's
wow. So I just thought that might sort of, be something to add a bit of context. My question is a really simple one. You mentioned that it was a small circulation. Do you know how
No,
much
as I was saying to
was?
Katja, no, I can ask, I'm seeing Radhika Sababala in a few days, I can ask her. I'm not sure they know, because I had asked them in the past. And there are, if you want, information such as these, which several of us probably hit sometimes, if you questions that remain unanswered. It's distributed abroad, as I said. It does have translations of its text in French. Its dominance, its importance is unquestioned. Then in terms of numbers, it's more difficult to answer your question in concrete terms.
Thank you, Devika. I just wanted to add to something that Nada's saying in terms of the way that Mulkraj Anand also in 1949 went to Sri Lanka to do a studio visit, and he went to see George Keith,
who was one of the contributing editors.
Yeah. But it's a really interesting anecdote, the sort of close reading that one can do on this is to say, well, what was being said then, if this was also the platform from where things were being said and discussions being had. So the conversation goes that he's coming to Sri Lanka and he's going to see this artist, and he's asking, Keith lives outside the capital, and people are saying, oh, who are you going to see? And there, the Colombo elite's response is, oh, that Gauguin, the Sri Lankan Gauguin. So when he comes to the studio visit, he of course retells this to Keat, says, I think he actually says, those fools. And they have this very interesting kind of conversation between one another about finding all the basically foreign endorsements of artists within India. So this conversation, was a studio visit, was in 1949. I mean, between then and now, how many millions of years we've gone through to still think about, maybe we're having the same conversation.
Yes.
But
Subodh Gupta is still the Jeff Koons of India. Or Damon Hirst.
Can I briefly ask you, I'm very curious to know more about the funding of the magazine.
It's funded by the Tata Group, and it still is. It still exists. What happens later on is that I took a little bit of liberty with the periodization of the slides in opposition to the text that I was reading, and you saw images of Expo 67 of the India Pavilion there, which a designer called Lashrat Patil designed. He showed these images, these film projections. But it still, as I said, it still exists until today. The shifts that happen is that it starts to have more and more issues that are dedicated just to one theme. So it changes its editorial, if you want, agenda because of that, because you no longer have the associations that sort of that we see here. The funding remains the same throughout. It's still the Tata Group. It's still housed at their office in a building that belongs to the Tata Group. That hasn't changed.